Okay, dear audience of today's online BIH lecture, it's time to start. My name is Christopher Baum. I'm the CEO of the Berlin Institute of Health. And as always, I will introduce our lecturer. Today we have as our guest Angelika Fretzen from the Wyss Institute. So she belongs to the Boston-Cambridge ecosystem and will inform us about keys to successful technology translation by entrepreneurs in academia and biotech. You should know that the R&D excellence of the Boston-Cambridge community is really highly impressive. More than 2,000 drug candidates have been identified until 2018. That's the latest statistics that I obtained. And these fill something like 14% of the US pharma pipeline and even 8% of the global pharma pipeline, only from this one large scientific community. Also, the patient impact is really stunning. There are more than 250 million patients that have been registered until 2018 in the US and 2 billion patients worldwide that were treated with therapies that have been developed in companies headquartered in Massachusetts and Boston, Cambridge. Now, the CV of Dr. Fretzen is also highly remarkable. She's a product development executive with over 20 years of experience in academia and biotech. After training as organic chemist and earning a diploma from the Julius Maximilians University in Würzburg, followed by a doctoral degree from the University of Geneva in Switzerland, Dr. Fretzen completed her postdoctoral fellowship with Gregory Verdine at Harvard University. And there she witnessed the takeoff and trajectory of the biotech sector in one of the leading innovation hubs in the world. She then took the opportunity to join a team of young entrepreneurs at Ironwood Pharmaceuticals, where she became vice president of chemical and pharmaceutical development, key inventor and member of the R&D team that successfully launched Linzess, which is a CFTR activating peptide for the treatment of obstipating gastrointestinal diseases. She then joined Catabasis as the senior vice president of pharmaceutical development, where she was overseeing the progression of a drug treating the NF-kappa B pathway from discovery to phase 3 clinical development designed for the treatment of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And in 2019, Dr. Fretzen became part of the executive leadership team at the Wyss Institute for Biology-Inspired Engineering. That's the designation of this institute. And I'm sure we will hear more about this particular mission in her talk. There she assumed product and business development responsibilities, and she's currently transitioning into the role of the Institute's Chief Operating Officer. That may suffice for the introduction. We are very proud to have you with us here in our digital format, and we are now looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you for the introduction. This is certainly a little bit an unusual format, and what I was really hoping to do with this very gracious invitation, thank you for that, was to visit the facility, to come to Berlin, to meet everybody of you, and to have a more active discussion about the biotech sector in Boston and also about the Wyss Institute. So we deal with what we got, and so I hope that this presentation resonates with you, and I hope that I'm going to see a few questions at the end of the presentation at least. So maybe a couple of disclosures right at the beginning of the talk. I have now transitioned really into an operational role, and so I will not do a data review. I will not do a scientific review here, while the Wyss in the biotech sector in Boston is a candy store of technology and technology development and interesting clinical candidates. Some of them I have been strongly involved with. I don't know that I'm in the position right now to talk about it, and I think especially the Wyss technologies, the actual inventors will do it much more justice than me talking about it. So what I'm going to do today is, share my perspective on the Wyss Institute as well as the sector in Cambridge and now in the entire region of Boston. And again, I'm not a scholar in this. This is not like a heavily researched field for me. I will share my perspective, and then maybe at the end of the discussion, it would be interesting to hear some of yours. What I also don't do is to compare my impressions to the ecosystem and to the biotech sector in Germany. I have left Germany in 1994 when I started my PhD in Switzerland, and since 1998 I've been living in Boston. So I think it would be ludicrous if I make comparisons that are very historical at this point. So let me go a little bit into my background, but important for the overall presentation. So I'm not going to go through my resume again. I'm just going to start in 1998 when I was joining Harvard University as a postdoc. And that is, you're going to see this little map on the top right corner. And I think what it tells you is it was relatively quiet still in Cambridge. We had Biogen, Genzyme, Vertex, so those were the kind of companies that already had formed and existed for a while. Some of them had actually already products for multiple sclerosis, for Gaucher's disease, in the case of Biogen and Genzyme, on the market, but still, Cambridge was not on the map. Cambridge was known for MIT and Harvard, but I would have argued that Cambridge was not known for high tech or biotech. High tech was really Silicon Valley at this point, and biotech was probably also more in the Bay Area as the central hub surrounding Berkeley, Stanford, UCSF, and Genentech at the time. When you lived your professional life at Harvard, even there, it was very clear that the high goal of a career was in academia. And if you were not interested in that, the recommendation was for a viable career to join one of the big pharma companies. Merck was very highly regarded at the time, Pfizer, BMS, those were typically the recommendations. When I left in 2000, it started to change a little bit. I wasn't the only one going into biotech. I know a number of people who actually started to join Millennium. It became clear that young founders actually would sometimes get a chance, especially when they came out of prestigious labs like Jerry Fink in our case, or Stuart Schreiber. Combinatorics was, for example, an Infinity we launched at about the same time. And what was remarkable was that now we saw young founders and some of the executives who came out of Vertex and Millennium starting their own endeavors. And I think that was a little bit of a turning point. But in my mind, the real turning point came in 2002, when Novartis made a huge announcement and really put Cambridge onto the map. Novartis announced that they would move their global headquarters for research in form of the Novartis Institute of Biomedical Research to Cambridge. They had put their hands on a 250,000 square feet building, and they were announcing that they would be recruiting 2,000 people. So that was, in my mind, and even looking back at it now, that was a turning point. All of a sudden, you had biotech and big pharma present. All of a sudden, you had key talent recruitment coming into Boston from all over the world. And a lot of people transitioned from Switzerland and Germany to Cambridge and put us on the map. And once you create a vacuum sucking up talent, you're going to have more and more come behind. And we're going to review that in some of the other cases that I was involved in. And then I think a second turning point was a major philanthropic gift, which was made to the Broad Institute, Isaac Broad. Of course, in the context of Eric Lander and the Human Genome Project. So this was a big, big turning point from a technology perspective and from the scientific side. And all that happened at about the same time. And all of a sudden you saw Velcade coming out of Millennium, and we saw real products. So all this will support a hypothesis, and my working hypothesis, again, this is not heavily researched, this is what I have observed and what we are trying to build our own system around at the Wyss. That in order to really translate technologies in an effective way, you have to build a strong innovation ecosystem. And you have maybe already noticed that the Wyss is biologically inspired, so it's not unusual that I choose this term. But when I look and think about an ecosystem, it's a diversity of functions. It's, you know, a lot of different stakeholders in an ecosystem. It is typically localized. It's typically spatially constrained. It's not going haywire into all kinds of regions around it. It is a strong network. It's a dense network of collaboration, and central knots and interconnections and synergies, and it's fluid. It's not static. And I think that is one of the observations that over the last 20 years even I have made between the US and Europe, that the fluidity is probably a little bit bigger in the United States. And so I'm going to come back to these different aspects of what I think are key success factors and key ingredients of this ecosystem. But this is exactly what we're trying to build at the Wyss. And so let me go a little bit into the Wyss. And even going back to that, you look at this and this is going to look like common sense, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. But that's true for a lot of business theory. When you come from science, and you're doing an MBA like I did, a lot of it feels like common sense. But building it and getting all the pieces in place and really knowing what your overall strategy is and how you optimize towards is a different story. And I would argue that the Wyss is doing it in a small model, and what has happened in the explosion in Cambridge is really the same thing in a big entity. So let's talk about the Wyss and introduce the Wyss to you a little bit and what we're trying to do. So we were also based on a major philanthropic bist. Hans-Jörg Wyss, who's an engineer himself and businessman, came out of Harvard Business School and had launched and built a very, very important business. Most of you are familiar with it. Gave a major philanthropic gift to Harvard. And it's important to note that if you visit Boston and Cambridge now, you find a lot of incubators, a lot of accelerators, some of them sponsored by J&J and some of the other industry partners who have come into the ecosystem, but at the time that wasn't the case. So this was really a new idea of taking high-risk research and technology development and focus on translation, especially at Harvard. I mean, this was something that MIT was very used to doing, and MIT is a very industry-focused organization to start with, but Harvard is not. It's a much more fundamental research-driven institution, as I think most of you are aware of. So what we wanted to have was a strong product development focus, but not industry-like, because a lot of times then you're confined by your stakeholders and by quality reporting and finances. So what we tried to do was marry this early stage high-risk research and then understand what the opportunities are to bring forward and translate into products. And so this was at the time especially a very disruptive model. In terms of the facilities, I like this entranceway. I remember when I interviewed at the Wyss and entered this lobby, it already feels different than academia, and it also feels different than industry. So we have now 11 core faculty and a number of associate faculty, and what typically happens is they have their own lab in their own academic institution where they can do the foundational research and they can lead their teams the way they want. But if they would like to collaborate with us and bring some of their researchers into the Wyss to focus on translation, that's what they're encouraged to do, and they're putting grants to us, and the collaboration really starts. I'm not going to go inside, some of the specifics here, but I do want to focus on this idea of ecosystem again. So what the Wyss did very early on, which I thought was brilliant, was put very well-defined collaboration agreements in place with a number of the key players in the Longwood area. And again, that's an interesting aspect of the Wyss. It didn't go to Cambridge. It went right next to the hospitals, into their own hotspots of clinical needs, invention, and technology development. So we have all these partners, and we're trying to reach into these different hospitals and organizations to understand what the needs are, to get interesting technology ideas, and then converge them with some of the very early discoveries and innovation that we make. Here, you can already see the aspect of ecosystem that is unusual for academia, and that I think was a very novel model at the time when the Wyss was formed. Now, I would argue a lot of people actually have looked at the Wyss and find it inspiring and intriguing and building these models in the Boston area too. All right, so I'm going to go back into the Wyss model here, and really the central part of the Wyss. So I have described already faculty, fellows, postdocs. So we have academic labs, and we have some of the people who in these academic labs would like to get involved more in translation, joining us at the Wyss on site typically, and then you saw the building. And then a very integral part of the Wyss is that we have a central staff that, to some degree serves us as our institutional memory. A lot of them have product development experience, sometimes from other institutions, but a lot of times from industry. So they know what a robust experiment is. They know how to teach postdocs and PhD students the gap between what we often see in academic labs and what the industry expectation would be, or even VC expectations would be. And so that's about a staff of 40 people on the product development side. We're adding business development to it, the integral part of the Wyss, of the center staff at the Wyss. And then where we are trying getting a lot of guidance from is in our network in Boston. We're reaching very regularly. We're reaching out to VCs. We're very strongly connected to the VC and industry network, to incubators and accelerators. And we are trying to be open enough so that these entities can give us feedback in terms of what the critical gaps are for our technologies to reach the patient or reach an application in sustainability. And then you add the executive team, where we also have a mix of academic focus as well as industry focus in their career. And we are guiding this whole process from, the skunk work of innovation, how Don Ingber, our founding director, would call it, to the product development aspects, a little more milestone focused, user friendly, application focused, and robustness of experiments focused. And that is obviously a goal that you're trying to practice every day and try to implement every day, together with an ever-changing environment of people joining and leaving the Wyss, sometimes with companies they're taking out. And so here's just an overview of faculty. You can see that some of them are at Harvard. Some of them, Jim Collins, for example, is at MIT. George Whitesides is at the chemistry department, where we are typically associated with HMS. And we have many more at different departments and different institutions who are acting as associate faculty to us. And that includes Tufts, that includes Boston University, that includes Dana-Farber. So we really are very integrated into a larger network, which is where my comparison to an ecosystem comes from. What's important, I do think, is that these academic labs can maintain their nature of academic focus and a lot of times strong competition within their academic field by having the home lab. But what they do at the Wyss and the people they send to the Wyss have an entirely different focus and a lot of times, and hopefully, entirely different mindset. And we're going to go into that a little bit more too. And this is our ATT staff. You can see that their background is diverse, sometimes healthcare, sometimes consumer products, sometimes research tools. It's a diverse team of people who bring all kinds of different perspectives to it. It converges engineers and scientists. And I think that's a very, very important aspect of the Wyss from the beginning, but also how we see now technologies evolve. And then it's easy to go to the Institute accomplishments. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I'm really not trying to tap our back here. But it is a combination of still academic excellence and very, very regular recognition of our academic labs, combined with translational successes, which we measure, for example, in patents or in IRBs. These are not necessarily human trials, but they are maybe human studies. Clinical trials. We haven't been in therapeutics as long, so the clinical trials for therapeutics are a little in the lower number, but you can see we have 41 startups, and those are licensing also included here. So we are starting to even have this network and extended family of the Wyss, of founders and people who've started their own enterprise based on Wyss technologies. The pipeline, and I think how you develop your pipeline is equally important for biotech as it is for the Wyss. The pressures can be different. So when we look at our pipeline, this is the academic side of things. This is where we really want to have the skunk works of idea generation going on. What Don would typically describe as the academic in our yin and yang team here, he would describe that typically academics, at least in the United States, you have a very targeted effort, you have 85% done, and then you apply for a grant. And in between your grants, you have a little bit of white space where you can do the real innovation. The Wyss went about it differently. We identified our core faculty and gave them a bucket of money and said, you go and do whatever you would like to do with this. And it doesn't have to be applied yet, because a lot of times it's foundational research that really opens up true innovation. And then our staff, which I had just introduced to you, starts to interact with these teams. We have platform leads that knows these teams really well, and they're starting to identify the ideas that might have merit in a user application. They try to identify the people who are collaboration and entrepreneurially minded. And all of that is a fluid environment. This is not something we force onto people. We're trying to identify the people that already have ideas and a personality and interest that is going into that direction. And that's, results in concept refinement together with our advanced technology team. It results in interaction with the business development team, and maybe most importantly at that stage, with a strategic patent lawyer, who's helping them to think about differentiation, what would be patent claims that are really valuable, and think about this whole process a little bit differently than from an academic publication perspective. And now we're starting to get in the world where academic innovation and high-risk technology meets the road to technology translation. So I was here at the concept refinement. And then at the technology validation stage is where we're going the first time into formal requests for proposals. So this is now an area where we're asking our teams to put together a business idea and really a technology idea fit together with the user need. So this is still early on, but they need to understand at least one fit between technology development and who would the end user be and what would be the specifications be to get to that end user. And that's what we are calling technology translation. And so these are we have typically 11 or 12 projects in our pipeline. They're getting strong central support, and then they get a little 200K budget that is translated into their research in the lab to get to this end user need. We're following these projects throughout the year. Once they have validated their technology, now is an important step in really getting external feedback. And so now these teams start to gel, really trying to understand a little bit of the entrepreneurial teams behind these technologies. And they're starting to go to venture capital firms. They're starting to go to potential industry partners and trying to understand what the gaps are. And once they have defined these gaps, a few of these projects, or some that come from the sidelines, they become institute projects. So now we're really starting to put the last pieces together so that a business plan can be formed, that these projects go out. And it's a sense of pride for people to have an institute project. But this mechanism also helps us to identify entrepreneurs coming out of the academic settings. We have one of the institute projects we have, and you can see it on this next slide in our whole funnel. This is our Cersei Institute project. It's a sustainability project. It's two entrepreneurs with Marika and Shannon who worked very heavily as postdocs in Penn Silver's lab, and were very academically focused on advancing their technology. And at some point, they put their business strategy together and a whole business plan, and they came to us, and now they're Wyss staff really advancing this project. And so this is what our pipeline looks like. A lot of times this is the early stunt work, and we always come up with new ideas. How can we package this? How can we make an initiative out of it? Can we involve others like venture capital or industry to maybe form a consortium and really do some blue skies thinking together so that we are addressing real problems rather than just driving our technology? That's what happens on this left side on the funnel. What I described as validation projects, we have about 11 or 12 of them. These are now in an area of different interests, therapeutics, diagnostics. Clearly, we're moving more towards therapeutics, which is not unusual for the Boston area. That's where the funding lies a lot of times. But we're becoming heavy in diagnostic. We have a diagnostic accelerator under David Wald, and we still try to foster sustainability. And every year looks a little bit different. And if you look at, so one of these are the institute projects. So we have just approved 4 this year. One is transitioning into their second year. And these guys with an infectious disease vaccine have a totally new interest right now, and they're about to leave our little engine in our building. And when you look at 2020, we have had a good number of startups coming out of the different labs, and they're now young companies outside of the Wyss in their own space. And with their own funding. So in the year 2020, which is remarkable if you think about COVID, these young entrepreneurs have raised money and found their space to start their own businesses. And I'm saying it's remarkable not because the money is not out there, but what we are hearing is that with under COVID, where a lot of these meetings are happening online, the trust in young entrepreneurs is maybe not quite as big as it could be if you meet the whole teams in person, and venture funds tend to be a little bit more conservative. That's what we have found, and that's why we're particularly proud that these teams have been able to go out in the last couple of years, or during this year. And then we had this COVID moment, and I do think this is one of those things that we're thinking very hard how to create these moments again without going through a global pandemic, obviously. So we had to shut down the institute. We relatively quickly brought a team back in that was COVID focused and therefore became essential. But what we realized was there was like a really supreme focus and collaboration spirit all of a sudden, and I'm sure that you have experienced this too. And this is where the convergence of engineers and scientists and diagnostics and therapeutic scientists really came to bear. So the first thing that happened is people started 3D printing protective equipment, because that was what America needed more than anything. And I'm not going to speak to the shortcomings of some of the things we have seen. But the engineers came really up with new swabs, with new PPE. And then in a second step, all of a sudden, they started to combine it with other technologies at the Wyss. So we have a specific startup that starts, they have identified an executive team. They're taking now swabs engineered at the Wyss, who are a little bit more user-friendly and smaller, and are combined with a diagnostic from Mike Springer's lab at HMS, who's actually a professor outside of the Wyss, but all of a sudden these collaborations happened, and they're taking it out as a company. And I think that was an important learning too, that all of a sudden COVID fostered an enormous amount of collaboration, but the local proximity, and there we come back to the ecosystem, really still stayed very prominent. Of course, the whole world did COVID research, and you have become very prominent in the vaccine research now too in Germany. But we still felt like the local connection, even though it was by Zoom, played a major role in putting these collaborations together. We did drug repurposing. Some of the mechanism of drug development were really accelerated through this focus on COVID. And we have a number of diagnostic teams. They now have entered a little bit of internal friendly competition. So there's a number of different technologies at the Wyss that can serve diagnostic purposes, but being so closely together and in a collaborative spirit, now a lot of times we identify a need, and based on what we experienced in COVID, we're putting these different technologies head to head, and maybe also with already marketed product, and really understanding which of the technologies is the right fit. And again, I think this ecosystem of collaboration, of knowing what the others are doing, of willing of working together, and also willing of, with some rigidity, finding the best approach, I think is going to be one of the major parts, not only in the presence at the Wyss, but also in the future. And I think one of the things that's now on your plate is to figure out how to define these COVID moments again, so that people don't get distracted and go get all their own ways, and that they're defining key problems that these teams of science engineers can converge around. So there was some interesting learning that came out of COVID, as I'm sure you have experienced too over the last 10 months. And then, I know that with Georg Duda, who is at the Charité, I've talked about this in quite some detail. Ultimately, you have to adjust your measures of success to what you're really trying to foster in this environment. And academic success a lot of times is publication and individual contribution. At the Wyss, it shouldn't be. But we can also not be out. We are not a VC, so we can also not measure return on investment. That's not something we should do. So what we are constantly looking at in terms of metrics, with even a board committee, is a number of different aspects of where we think we follow the mission of the Wyss and that are really fostering translation. And you find a lot of aspects of the ecosystem right here, which is collaboration, and those are measurable inputs, innovation, where we can measure by disclosures and patents, and actually also benchmarked how other institutes. Commercialization, we can measure in terms of licensing agreement, either to other parties or to our startups. Entrepreneurship, how many entrepreneurs do we foster and form and support and give them some business sense and make them into founders? And how well does our network of founders, after they have left the Wyss, connect? Because I would always make the strong argument that impact doesn't happen just at the Wyss. If we then afterwards forget about our companies, they still might not have an impact, and we need to continue to support them. And then outcomes are becoming a little bit more subjective, I think, especially if you work on a wide range from healthcare all the way to sustainability, from engineering all the way to synthetic biology, and in the convergence of all of it. So the outcomes might actually come a little bit more in form of case studies and thorough examination of where it works and where it doesn't. And then I'm going to give you a case study now. ReadCore is maybe our most prevalent case study of 2020. So ReadCore was a technology that came out of the George Church lab, and it is a sequencing technology that allows sequencing in very dense tissue and then then analyzes the data in a very visual way. So that's maybe in a nutshell what that really is. And the first publications came out well before the Wyss existed. The underlying not the underlying technology, but the foundational science had already been mentioned and developed very early on prior Wyss. But what happened then at the Wyss was this convergence of synthetic biology and engineering. And all of a sudden, we hired a lead engineer. We actually very early on put a whole room aside where we can started to develop a prototype of this instrument. And this first instrument prototype was engineered at the Wyss. And what that allowed to do was now to go out to venture capital and actually show them this is not just the scientific concept, this is how it works. And that's what I think is the beauty of when these fringes of different sciences come together. And the lead engineer is actually now the CEO of ReadCore. Then they put all this technology and the fundamental science together and published their seminal paper in 2014. So all this took a while, but also it was in the time when the Wyss was actually being built on parallel, not unlike a biotech. And then as an institute project, typically what we do, we try to find an entrepreneur in residence who brings the business aspects to bear. And this entrepreneur in residence became actually the first CEO of this company. So they started to raise money. They started Series A and Series B. This is a research tool, not a therapeutic. So, after 2 fundraisers, they were able to pursue an exit strategy and were now bought by 10x Genomics. And I'm sure there is some strange changes coming around in these companies, and we're going to hear a lot more about it. But what we did do is we reached out to this team. And by the way, 9 founders came out of the Wyss. So one of the fluidity of the Wyss is that these founders move, and sometimes we have a whole team going out of the Wyss, which allows a very effective technology translation into this new company and technology transfer, and it kind of opens up a vacuum at the Wyss that new ideas, new people, new dynamics can flow into it. And so this is where this dynamic of an ecosystem comes in. It cannot be static, otherwise you get stuck, and it is very hard to do good and continuously innovative technology translation. And so when we reached back out to the founders and asked, well, this is one of our success stories now, so what was it? There was a very strong feedback in terms of where the Wyss made its contribution and what you might want to think about if you want to start something similar. The strong IP portfolio, I was mentioning the ability to have an early IP discussion, strategic IP discussion, and then help build this IP over time. One of the employees told me it was really the convergence of chemistry, hardware engineering, software engineering, that at the Wyss, with this convergence of disciplines, we could do all at the same time, ultimately leading to a working prototype that we really only optimized as part of the company. The technology validation, so they knew it worked. They had some funds and time to really try it out and test robustness. And then the diverse entrepreneurial team, again, 9 people went out. And they took already different roles as the company, and basically, other than a lot of the administrative staff they needed to find, and a lot of times you can outsource that, they were basically up and running. And then one of the things they said too, which was very interesting, was they had learned how to write grants and how to write industry appropriate grants that you can actually get into the company. So it was not an NIH grant, which is, I think, a lot more academic focused. But the Wyss works a lot with DARPA, which is really product and blue sky thinking. What does the military of the future look like, and what does society of the future like focus? And some of these grants they learned how to write, and they were allowed to take with them, be transferred to the company. And so they had the concept of not only raising funding and sending and showing a prototype to the VCs, but they already had an entry to non-dilutive funding that was startup appropriate. A lot of funding, I would argue, you shackle yourself. You don't want to take into a startup. And so we're trying to give them a lot of guidance on that side too. And this is like the story that we see with a lot of startups. So this is like just a quick summary of just new stories we're seeing from different startups out of the Wyss. Sherlock was a collaboration between us and the board. There's IP from both coming in. Emulate is coming out of Don Ingwer's lab, and has been around for a while now. So these are the organ on chips. And some of these are newer companies. Metalmark, I2O is a more drug delivery concept. Dino is another sequencing project and gene delivery project. Rewalk is robotics, so you can see the wide range of technologies at the Wyss, and of course they're going to go out in their own little pockets. But the way the technology is built is a lot of times in the convergence of a lot of disciplines. So I'm going to go relatively fast here because I do not want to run out of time. And then I want to focus a little bit for 5 minutes on this idea of collaboration, because I think that is one of the major steps between academia, where I think, at least from what I remember, and maybe that has changed, but my understanding is still that what's rewarded is the individual contributor. To somebody who wants to form a company and actually translates a technology, even if you're out licensed in the industry, all of a sudden you have to become a supreme team builder and relationship builder. And that is a big gap, and you have to reward it, you have to nurture it, you have to teach it. This is not, the technology can be as good as you want it to be, but if you cannot build a powerful team around it, I do believe it's not going to go anywhere. And what you find in a startup a lot of time is your first technology might not go as you thought, but if you have built a strong team around it, you will come up with a second generation or even a totally new product, as happened to us at Microbia. So we are trying, and I have this slide up here because this is a very consistent teaching at the Institute, is you need to change your mindset. You cannot just think technology anymore. You need to think about your leadership team, about your colleagues you work with, about your board, about your mentors. So now start to think team and learn how to share and open up, because in an academic environment where you're constantly worried about being surpassed by somebody else who gets the first publication in the field, you do want to hold your cards close to your chest. In this case, you have to be a lot more strategic about it. You don't want to share everything, but you want to share enough of a good story that you get a good team at your side. And so that's why I think for the Wyss, collaboration is really central, the teaching of collaboration and the practicing of collaboration. And I have a few examples here that also then lead to technology and startup successes. So in this first example, we actually continued to collaborate very strongly with a startup that came out of the Wyss. This was ReadCore Robotics. This is a technology that helps people to walk again after they have a stroke or something, and came out of the Cambridge labs. And we actually did maintain even a long-term collaboration with the startup after it left the Wyss, and made sure that, within sometimes the realm of conflict of interest concerns, so all by the books, but in a way that we could still support the startup. I think we helped them to get much further along into an approved product than they could have done on their own. So we continued the collaboration so that the innovation that happened in the academic lab, in the product translation that happened in the startup, kept going all together. This was an interesting one because some of the organ on chips has a very long history at the Wyss of going through major grants, maybe from DARPA, and in this case a lot of it came from DARPA, through industry collaboration, which always helps us to understand how to make a technology more robust and what questions we should really ask to ultimately take a whole entrepreneurial team out. And at that point, they know how to meet milestones. DARPA grants are very milestone driven. They know how to collaborate and that they cannot keep their results close to their chest. And they might be in a much, much more advantageous stage to actually get out of the Wyss and start their own collaborations, and sometimes they take them along with it. And maybe the most recent one that you might have seen if you have followed press releases around the Wyss is a strong alliance with one of the venture capital firms who had already invested in 3 of the Wyss startups, so clearly they were fans. And here, this is the kind of alliance and collaboration we try to foster in the future, also with sustainability in mind for the Wyss. Northbound Venture formed an arm that's called Northbound Labs that set $15 million aside to us. We already have strong collaborative teams with them now on the first project where they're really thinking much bigger than they would have done just with the Wyss alone. But we also have a $2.5 million, like $500K per year of funds that we can, with the council, attribute to smaller pipeline projects and help the pipeline going. So this is a template for alliances. The partner who we chose here, again, is a partner that typically invests in syndicates, so they know collaboration. And I said it earlier, I do think the biotech world in Boston has also become much more collaborative. The venture firms are constantly talking to each other, and there are sub-firms that form syndicates together on a very regular basis, and you could nearly regard them as close colleagues. That I do think is an observation that has changed over time in biotech, where it's not so strictly competitive anymore. but it's the same players. People know each other, and I'm going to go into that a little bit because I think spatial proximity plays a big role, and I do believe it will play a big role even after COVID. So here's my experience from the Fenway side of the river, that we do need to foster high-risk research and grants and trying to do academic research in between grants. I'm not sure it's going to get us there. So this idea of a pot of money, do what you want with it, be as creative as you can, is an important aspect of the Wyss. The relationship and team building, I don't want to dwell on it because I have spent some time. The conversion of disciplines and the collaboration, I think, is incredibly important for technology translation. Translation doesn't happen in one single academic idea. It happens in the team, and it happens in many, many disciplines. And that's anybody coming out of academia, going into biotech, will experience that very, very quickly. So now let's go back to the Boston ecosystem, because I do think in small, the Wyss reflects what this bigger ecosystem looks like and what made it so successful. And some of these numbers, I got them from July, so I heard some of these numbers earlier, and they were even higher. You actually cited 8% of the global development pipeline. But the power of this interconnected ecosystem in Boston is absolutely mind-blowing. And where it has gone from 2001, where I saw it just waking up, to where it is now, is just like an exponential curve and self-accelerating. And I don't have to go through all the numbers. Of course, we have an enormous amount of hospitals, enormous amount of NIH funding goes into Massachusetts. And that doesn't even count DARPA and small business grants and all the other, just even government funding that these companies and these higher education universities receive. Venture capital, unbelievable, like 3.1 billion. That's just, and it just increases. The lack of capital does not seem to hit us at all. 20-30% of the US IPOs came out of Massachusetts, and you can read these numbers. It's mind-boggling. And when you visit Massachusetts from year to year to year, and especially the Boston area, not just Cambridge, the buildings are just coming out of the ground. Now it's Somerville. Before it was Cambridge and Kendall Square. Now it's the Fenway area. It was the Harbor area when Vertex. It just keeps going. And some of it is self-inflicted. There is an old theory of the knowledge spillover theory of entrepreneurship. It's in one of the publication that speaks to this fact that there is innovation spills over locally in concentric circles. It doesn't leap far from a spatial perspective. Is an old paper. It's from 1993. So you're going to sit there and say, why are you citing a paper from 1993? The reason why I'm citing is this is a paper that's being brought up by investors on a very regular basis, and that's why they're going to sit in Cambridge. They're not going to necessarily go much further than maybe New York. I just recently talked to somebody who's managing the investment of a major family office, and he was citing this paper. He said, we want to look at the Wyss because you are in Cambridge, and we do know that this innovation spillover still happens concentrically, localized, and it dilutes out very slowly. So we will continue to invest in Cambridge. And we are citing papers from 1993. So even under COVID, all this might have changed. We're all on Zoom all day long. But the mindset of where the capital is going to go, I do not believe is going to change so quickly. And that's why we keep building labs in Cambridge. And this is what it looks like. So one last point I want to make around this is the Cambridge environment now. When I started there in '98, there was hardly anything there. I would go from the T station to the movie theater, and it was a war zone. There was a little tiny Biogen building, and that was it. And then on the side there was Kendall Square 1 with Genzyme in it, but that was it. This is what it looks like now, and I think it is a testament to this technology spillover. I joined Ironwood Pharmaceuticals up here in the corner. And the one thing I took home was that the mobility, so I've talked about collaboration, I talked about this network, about innovation, about spatial, limitations in terms of where the innovation goes. But this mobility, I think, is a very important point. So when we founded Microbia in '98, I joined in 2001. The major advance came when we hired 3 senior executives from existing companies. They came from Sepacor, Pharmacia, and they brought each other in. So we first hired a medicinal chemist from Pharmacia, who was actually the inventor behind Cellobex, and he brought Mark Curry in, who was our CSO. And I think that was the success factor in a lot of starting companies, that talent moves, talent knows each other. That's why the spatial proximity comes in. And there has to be a mobility in talent. If people all stay in their own company and wait for their retirement, biotech is very hard to pull off, because the young idea founders, even though they might become the CEOs, as it was the case in the CSO and the COO, as it was the case in Microbia, they still need some experience, and in some ways, even when it goes about how do you set up payroll, how do you build your financial systems. And there is mobility and talent in Cambridge. And I think that is one of the most remarkable factors that allows these small companies still to grow very fast and be successful. And this is kind of the story behind Ironwood. I'm not going to go into that. I just wanted to make the point that I do think one of the key success factors here is talent coming in with experience. It doesn't have to be big pharma experience anymore, as it was at the time, but some form of experience that accelerates the development of technology and of a small company. And so this is what I want to summarize as my major experience from the Cambridge, that the professional network in Cambridge is very tight. People know each other. Companies are being bought and split. And every time there is a movement of talent. And the big movement maybe started with Novartis, creating this incredible vacuum and pulling all kinds of talent in. But by now, even Ironwood, that central core of 100 people at Ironwood, they sit in probably 200 different companies now, or have experience of 200 different companies, and they can pull each other in. They know who is good, and they're going to use this network. That's where the spatial proximity might be the more important factor than invention spilling over. It's the people spilling over, and you need to move into a place where you have that mobility. And so that's why I think an ecosystem needs this fluidity, and it is spatially restricted. It's not. This is not going to happen across the entire United States. And so I'm going to come to the conclusion in the sense that I do think all these pillars to the ecosystem are important. And like an ecosystem, if one of them is missing, I do think an ecosystem can make up for it, but it does weaken the whole system. And so if you want to take technology out, if you want to drive innovation and have an impact, I do think it is important to look for this ecosystem, where are all these pillars already there, and to build your own with a lot of these success factors in mind. And I'm going to conclude, and we're running a little late, but I'm going to contribute that to technical difficulties. So thank you for your attention. I hope you stuck around.
Well, thanks so much for this great, inspiring, and highly informative lecture. I think we learned a lot. I'm specifically interested in the really innovative format and philosophy of the Wyss Institute, which is really different to most of the other institutes that we are used to see. One of the aspects that you pointed out was that you have a very small core faculty, and on the other hand, you aim for high fluidity in the projects and the associate faculties. But how do you then maintain fluidity in the core faculty? Is it needed to have some fluidity there as well, or is that really designed to be stable for the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so you got right to the heart of it. We have been relatively constant in core faculty, and there's also like a limited diversity in there. So that is certainly something that we have to think about for the future, and I don't think that is in our vision for the future, that core is not going to change. I do think we need to find new young faculty and idea, and that will come with a long-term sustainability of the Wyss too. It's tough to pull people in if you live from donation to donation, and I hope that will change over time. Where we have seen the dynamic is on the associate faculty, where anybody who wants to collaborate with anybody within our network can pull somebody in, and they can receive funding, and they can become part of these teams. So that's where we have seen the fluidity. On the core faculty, we do need over time, we do need a revised concept, I believe.
Thank you. Now we have questions coming in that are typed into the chat. There was a question by Ling Yao. She asks, how can a scientist manage to do an MBA while still working as a scientist in a company or academia?
So I choose to do so. We don't expect people to do an MBA, by the way. Sometimes they get formative training from us. Sometimes we bring in somebody in from Harvard Business School who we team up with a team. So there's no expectation at the Wyss that people get an MBA. But as somebody who has done it, I decided to go into an MBA program relatively early in my career because now I had decided against an academic career and I wanted to get the business knowledge, and some of it was eye-opening. What I did not choose one of the top-notch schools. I chose one where I could learn what I needed to learn, and I could do it as an evening program. So that's what I chose to do. It was time-consuming. Sometimes the operational challenges are there because you're a lot of times asked to do a lot of teamwork. But I do think that's one of the things that's going to change in the future, that a lot of it is going to happen online, and there's a lot more mobility and fluidity and new options on how you get teamwork done. So I do think it's doable. It's just you got to set the time aside, and you can do a part-time MBA. Some people do an MBA because they really want to create. You're going to go to a not top-notch school. They want to get the network out of Harvard Business School, and then I do think full-time is probably the way to go. If it is to understand the concepts and to learn and to have a little bit of more transparency into things like net present value and how do you do finance and how you do accounting, I would just choose a little bit of a lower key school and learn it there, because ultimately it's how much you get out of it is entirely dependent on you. So I think it's possible to do. You might not choose the top-notch school if you don't want to stop working at the same time. Now, some schools in Massachusetts offer it. MIT has, I think, an evening program. I hope that answered your question. But actually, from our side, from the Wyss side, it's not an expected thing that somebody who wants to start a company needs to get an MBA. That's not what we do.
Thank you. The next question is, at which stage the entrepreneurs should come in? Should the initial academic pioneer always need to drive the project? Or is there a safe way you have developed to, quote unquote, clamp the umbilical cord?
That's a very hospital way to put it. Again, the Wyss is one of the things that the Wyss is. It's fluid, and there's a lot of different models. So I would always encourage to think as a founder and owner of your technology. And sometimes that might mean that you stay an advisor to a company and you actually might pursue your academic career. So we're not even expecting everybody to become an entrepreneur. And sometimes you want to become an entrepreneur. Even then, I would think you want to think as a founder. Maybe you become, a technology officer. Maybe you become CSO. You don't necessarily have to become CEO. And we make it dependent on your interests. Sometimes if we see the talent, we try to help people to become that CEO. It is sometimes easier to focus on the technology and drive your technologies just like you would drive it with a PhD, in a PhD, but maybe to a little more robustness together with our staff. And we would try to find a great partner at Harvard Business School or some repeat entrepreneur and partner it up with the team. So again, when I talk about this fluidity and mobility, we don't have one process that applies to every team, because the interests are different, the technologies are different, the life cycle is different, the investors are different and what they're looking for. So it's tough to put one process down. I would still say what you want to focus is on your technology, on what's the use case is, and at some point it becomes natural where the switch occurs. And you might be more interested in product development and go that way, or you might be interested in teaming up, who's taking over that part versus you focus on technology.
Yeah, another question that I have is, isn't it a bit ironic that in this era of digital exchange, we still need the critical mass on one side to have the spillover taking place? Wouldn't it also nowadays be working simply through digital networking?
Yeah, I do think some of it is going to change. I mean, the COVID experience is it's an experience that is new to all of us. But I can tell you that even the Wyss is strongly built on community, and holding that community together right now, where people don't have the personal interaction, is tough. As much as I think it's gotten better than I expected at the beginning, I thought Zoom would break down all the time because everybody's using it all the time, and we would have a lot more problems. So we have made progress on the scientific side. But if a model is so community and collaboration based, this is a tough time. It's nicer to be able to chat in the corridor, exchange ideas. And as much as that's true for the small ecosystem of the Wyss, I still do think that's also true for the larger ecosystem in Boston. You would be surprised how many ideas are exchanged in networking events in Boston, or old colleagues going to lunch together. And a lot of times in Kendall Square, you had to be careful what you talked about because everybody around you was biotech. So I think there are certain processes that we're going to become more flexible around. Company formation, collaboration, relationship building, finding investors, philanthropy. There is still a personal relationship component to it, and I would still argue that Zoom doesn't do it. We are in our third gift phase at the Wyss. We are starting philanthropy, or at least we were planning to start philanthropy. And how are you going to build those relationships from scratch in a Zoom call? So we basically put that on ice because some relationships have to just be built personally. So that was my point in saying it's not just spillover of technology, it's relationships between people. And that I do think spatially they're still going to be confined to a certain area because people do want to meet. And it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. Some of it might become easier because we're now online and digitalized. Some of it might become harder because it might take a while until people actually want to travel and fly again. And I could imagine that the East Coast versus West Coast connections will change. And it might be to the better because it's digitally interconnected, or it might be to the worse because people don't want to travel. So I think that's still going to all play out, and we do not know how it's going to play out.
Okay, many thanks again. There are no more questions coming up in the chat, but I'm sure people have been really inspired, and there's a lot to be considered in the next days and weeks. And I also look forward to opportunities of continued interactions with you. And indeed, we have some time now for a personal exchange. I'm very much looking forward to that. Thanks to all the people in the audience. We had about 80 people joining today's lecture, and we wish you all a pleasant and healthy holiday season, and especially stay healthy in this challenging time. That's highly important for everybody. Okay, thanks for being with us today, and see you next time with our next lecture.